This is a pretty radical thing, and we've just started to do this today.
What you're actually saying is now, instead of going from writing up a to-do to a PR, you come out of the meeting, Claude's already written a bunch of code.
It's a bit crazy, but we're trying it out.
I think this is the concrete stuff. Everyone's figuring this out in real time.
I might get in trouble for talking about it because we probably seem like crazy people.
It's only borderline crazy. It'll be hardly crazy at all in 6 months. It's a fascinating time to be building a startup, but it also feels like the best time, doesn't it? Because startups are about challenging the status quo.
It sounds like it's quite exhausting. It is really fun.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Keoki Alexander-Chang.
If there is one meta trend underlying what AI is doing to startups and their products at every level, it is about adaptation. When the underlying technology is changing and improving as fast as AI is, that means that everything you thought that was true 3 months ago isn't true anymore. And so your core skill needs to become adaptation and thinking about how can we be building a product for today and for 6 months from now when everything's going to be so different. Today's guest is a founder of a company that has mastered that art of really fast adaptation. Everything they do, they think about how can the latest tools and the latest AI tech really help them level up. Keoki shares some really wild things they're doing. Like, for example, they now wear lapel mics to every meeting so that Claude can start building solutions to what they're doing before they've even left the meeting. Keoki is founder and CEO of Minikai, a startup devoted to using AI to reduce the administrative burden across the disability and aged care sectors. Prior to being the founder of Minikai, he was an AI architect at Deloitte. Keoki has been thinking about and using applied AI for far longer than most, and now he's applying it in a really challenging real-world setting. I'm excited to talk to him about how he's using AI to build person-centered experiences. Keoki, welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Yaniv.
As I was saying before we started recording, I noticed this very heavy emphasis on your website on this term person-centered design. And I think design in the era of AI is something that I've been thinking a lot about. I think it's not a solved problem. As you build Minikai, which as I understand is a very AI-forward tool, it's effectively an agentic tool. What does it mean to have a person-centered design, and how do you approach that?
When we say person-centered AI in the context of disability and aged care, we mean that quite literally in the sense that each individual who receives care actually gets their own dedicated AI agent or AI advocate. In the case of Minikai, we call them minis. So each person gets a mini.
That's adorable.
Yeah, it's pretty cute. And so the mini can assist those different stakeholders. And it's very personalized to that individual. The context relates to that person and learns and adapts from the interactions that people have with that agent to help facilitate the best quality care on behalf of that individual.
So that's really interesting because it sounds like you're actually already at the stage where you are building agents that are, you said advocate, it nearly sounds like a proxy for somebody who needs care that is able to take some of that burden off them, which I think is pretty close to the cutting edge at the time of recording, which is March 2026. We should timestamp this for folks listening. I imagine there are a lot of challenges to that, both from a design point of view, right? Putting the right guardrails in place, making sure that the agent has the right permissioning to do things on behalf of an individual. But also more generally, you're working in a regulated environment, and a lot of founders are trying to build products that solve problems in regulated environments, and AI represents a massive opportunity for that. But it's also a big challenge to figure out how to comply when you're building these powerful tools.
That's a huge topic, and yeah, really interesting one. I think, firstly, the use of AI is actually a really good solution to be able to reduce the regulatory burden on organizations or help actually improve compliance. So I think in a way it can actually be thought of as a solution. But I think in the case of the space we're in with disability and aged care, there's a lot of compliance around the sensitivity of people's private health information. AI doesn't really change the equation when it comes to the privacy obligations that organizations need to adhere to. For example, the Privacy Act and the Australian privacy principles in our case here. One of the things that's been foundational for us is getting the security right, developing a model of data that AI is using in the background that facilitates fine-grained access control of that information. This is really important when it comes to the entitlements that an agent has in what it can access on behalf of a user.
I guess one of the things that comes to my mind when we talk about an agent in a setting like this, I completely agree with you around the fine-grained access control, but how do you stop, I guess, what I sometimes call the agents gone wild problem, which is agents acting unpredictability outside of expected parameters or hallucination? So, I mean, it's all well and good to have your fine-grained access control to sensitive data, but what if the agent just hallucinates a piece of information that is not accurate? How do we smooth off those rough edges of the AI so it can be fully usable in these scenarios?
I think this is speaking to two other important aspects of person-centered design in the context of AI, one of which is provenance. So this is the idea that the source of information is always clear and the change of ownership in information is always clear. So I think there's a really obvious way that people would generally understand how this is implemented from a user experience point of view, where you have groundedness in the agent's responses. So you are always referencing existing data and then citing that data in the responses of AI and making sure that someone can check that. The second aspect that's really important is keeping the human in the loop. And this is actually very granular design choices that you make in the user experience where you are deliberately adding friction, is what we've found. So, for example, one of the things that registered nurses will do in residential aged care is take progress notes, which will contain clinical observations of someone receiving care in that residential care home. You could have an agent synthesize a fake note if you weren't careful. So what's really important is you keep the human in the loop, which means a note can only be created based on the context that's captured by a clinician. So you're actually, you're striking a balance between allowing the agent to assist someone while also making sure that it's clear how they're kept in the loop and responsible for actually providing that input.
That's really good. And definitely when I read person-centered design, this is the sort of thing that I think has been very much on my mind, is that term design for a long time has been focused quite a lot, too much in my view, on visual design, right? Which is you spend a lot of time in Figma figuring out how it looks, figuring out perhaps the flow of screens and so on. Design has always been more than that, right? Design is how something works. But I think in this era of AI, this is really becoming much more important because quite often you have the interface is either just text or chat, or we have these sort of agents that go off and do things without you. There is actually no visual footprint to large aspects of the design. And yet these are not technical questions, right? These are genuinely product design questions. And so I think this is really important for folks listening to understand. I think you're doing it right, which is to be thinking about when you are creating these agents, these proxies, these interfaces, to really think thoughtfully about how they behave and what the guardrails are. And like you said, introducing friction is a really interesting design choice and perhaps a counterintuitive one to people who've spent a long time thinking about growth loops and getting, reducing the amount of time to that aha moment and all that. Like there's still an element of truth to that, of course, but it's fascinating that I think this new technology has created an entirely new surface for different types of design decisions. And in my view, the startups that win are going to be the ones who take the discipline of design very, very seriously in this new world.
I completely agree with that. I think a really important and interesting design question is, what does it look like if you are to take a peek into the agent's work in the middle of its work? Because you don't actually need to be the initiator of work. And it is obviously one of the great benefits of agents is that they can work on something continuously in the background. and pull a human in for review or for the input when needed. But what does the actual user experience, what does the product surface look like if you were to just pay a visit to the agents while they're working and see, what they're in the middle of? What can you see about what they're doing? What are the traces that are visible to humans? I think that's a really interesting design problem or design question.
Yeah, so sort of seeing what's happening under the hood nearly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And are there any surprising things or like novel insights on the design of Minikai that have happened as you've gone through this journey where you're like, I didn't expect that it was going to be this way, but this turns out to be the right design?
Yes, definitely. So I remember in the beginning, we were really resistant to the chat interface, the conversational interface, because we thought it's a bit trite. I think for it, in our specific application, it's really stood the test of time, at least so far, because it is very intuitive to the user to have a conversational interaction. I think also what has surprised me is this sort of new design choice you have to make in your product about whether or not you keep a user experience fairly consistent between sessions or across users versus whether you actually completely generate that user experience on the fly or the UI itself on the fly. And so to what extent do you actually personalize the UI based on the context of the user's query or what the user's trying to do? That's something I didn't necessarily, it's I think quite novel.
I've definitely had to readjust my mental frameworks quite quickly because the underlying AI models have really progressed so much, especially in the last 6 months. A lot of things that were not really viable 6 months ago, where you're like, can I just call an AI tool to generate UI on the fly? I would have been like, no, that's a terrible idea. But it's not a terrible idea anymore. And the thing that's got my head spinning, and I think has a lot of folks anxious, but it's also really exciting, is what's it going to be like in another 6 months? And how do you design a product that is not just there for the capabilities that exist today, but for the capabilities that might be there in 6 months? Now, at any point, we might hit a bit of a ceiling where we're like, the models are not advancing as quickly as we thought they would. People in the know seem to think that they will still continue to advance at a good pace for a while. And so I think this pace of technological advancement, at least in my career, has not ever been matched. So how do you build a product that is robust to not just how things are now, but how things are going to be in the relatively near future?
This is a very good question. I think it is partly just knowing, or at least trusting, the increasing capability will continue. And so you don't develop things that are workarounds based on the current model's limitations. I think that in and of itself is kind of difficult because you have to say no to things. I mean, this is what we found. It's, wouldn't it be great to add a feature? Then really we've found pretty consistently that the next model means that feature is totally irrelevant. And in fact, there's actually far less development than we thought we had to do that needs to be done. It's almost like thinking of your product as like a garden that's growing and just tending to your garden, which at times means pruning things as well. So you're not always adding things. Sometimes you're distilling something back to kind of maybe its sort of core essence and then, simplifying it as opposed to adding stuff. Yeah, I feel like that's been our experience.
I think that's really valid, and it takes a certain amount of, I think, maturity, because what you realize is this product or this feature that you put a lot of work into building, it can now just be effectively supplanted by a prompt into a newer model and so on. And then, like you said, I think the pace of pruning needs to be quite aggressive, and definitely there does seem to be this trend, right, where you had to do a lot of scaffolding for certain things, say a year ago, and now that scaffolding is no longer necessary. And so you should take the scaffolding down. But you might need to scaffold something new. And in another 6 months, that scaffolding may need to come down. So software has always been a dynamic thing, but I think this just makes it even more dynamic.
Yeah.
And that's maybe a good segue as well, because this is something I've also noticed with the product building process, right? Which is, as AI has seeped into how we build, increasingly you can have a more direct interaction with the tooling. I believe you've got a team of between 10 and 15 people, and that you've been investing very heavily, I guess, in being an AI native startup, which is now we're talking about the internal operations, not just the product itself, but in terms of how you build the product, how you build and run the business. What's your evolution been there, and what are the biggest learnings that you've had along the way?
I think we've always been heavy users of AI, like from the very beginning. It's just probably now, I mean, especially with Claude and Cowork and Claude Code, the amount that we can get done has multiplied quite significantly. It's very clear that people's jobs are shifting to being designers, engineers or designers, and sort of architects and directors of AI. One of the big things that we've started to shift to is not thinking about what work do I need to do, but instead what context do I need to curate? And that could be related to anything. So it could be what context needs to be accessible to Claude in terms of the use of our product, or billing, or financial data, or our own internal meeting transcripts. We're essentially at the moment making sure that every piece of context that is useful for Claude to be able to do work for us is being captured in a kind of a sort of seamless way. And then this analogy of the garden kind of applies, because you're really just tending to the garden and pruning the context to make sure it's like quite clean and tidy, so that if you generate a document, it's pulling from correct, up-to-date information, that type of thing. So I think, this has been a really big shift in the way that we work. It's to the extent where we've actually decided our job descriptions are actually something that we will continuously update as a self-reflection exercise to understand how my job has changed, even within this past month or past 2 months, based on my use of AI. So that's kind of this is a very recent thing that we've realized we should be doing, but that's, I think that's pretty unusual.
It is unusual, and there's so much to unpack there, and I'd love to get into, I guess, some of the nitty-gritty details there. Like maybe, first of all, let's talk about this sort of context curation. Perhaps you can give some examples of the types of activities that you are now using AI for, that you're gaining a lot of leverage from, and the work you needed to do, I guess, the sort of context engineering or context curation to actually enable those use cases. Like what are the top things that represent good examples of that?
I think product engineering, and engineering is like a pretty obvious one with Claude Code. So I can maybe talk to sales as an example. So how kind of Claude and our use of AI has shifted that. What we now do is we have a continuously running scheduled task in Cowork that will review text messages, emails, meeting transcripts continuously, and then be essentially updating all of our deals in HubSpot with all of the relevant context based on the latest interactions. So the most recent next steps agreed in a meeting, or something like that with a particular individual. So that means that at any point in time, our sales pipeline is completely up to date. And essentially Claude it just does that in the background. So then it can then use that downstream as a source of context to understand what sales follow-ups or additional outreach needs to be done. So then it can essentially review our entire pipeline, has all of the context from that Claude has already curated upstream, to then draft all of the email communications and then just say, this is ready for a review. Do you want to send it off? So my entire job has changed to essentially reviewing generated outputs from Claude for follow-ups and rocking up to meetings and talking to people and just being really present and engaged in what they're talking about and helping them as much as I can. But knowing that all of the coordination and retrieval of information and a large part of the written communication that will happen to follow things up will be done by Claude. And that's just like a really different way of working.
Then I'd love to understand a bit more. You've talked about the sort of job description aspect of things. So maybe give some concrete examples of job descriptions in your company, or people who have recently updated their job descriptions quite significantly as a result of these changes, and what's been the impact of going through that process.
There's a recent example that springs to mind where a big part of what we do is integrating with clinical systems. So we'll do fairly complex data integrations to bring that clinical data into our platform. This requires a lot of upfront work to map out all of the data and make sure that it's translated into a format that's really useful once it's in our platform. This has been a very manual task to begin with and is just being done more and more by Claude, where people are just reviewing essentially. And, you have a spectrum of people's sort of optimism or bullishness towards like how much they can use AI for. And I think that's like a really healthy sort of type of diversity to have in your team, because you need the healthy level of skepticism. But I know that, we have an AI engineer in our team who recently updated his job description to make sure that everyone understood the frontier capability of Claude in their job. So all of the things that they might currently be only partially automating through the use of AI, or they haven't yet thought about automating with AI, he's actually updated his job description to say, I'm going to make sure we understand every bit of work that we're currently doing that AI can do instead.
So his job is nearly like AI automator.
AI automator, yeah.
I think fundamentally there's this sort of sense of fluidity, right? That's nearly the meta point that comes away from all of this, which is that when the capabilities of the software are changing so rapidly, you need to be constantly adapting your product, your team, your roles, your processes to keep up with that, right? And I think the companies that win will be the ones that get good at that. I would call it a meta skill, right? Of rapid adaptation.
I think there's a limit to it as well. I mean, there are things that do stay very stable. And it sounds like it's quite exhausting when you put it that way, even though it is true. But I would say it is really fun, and it's a really enjoyable process. And I also see why having small teams is actually really beneficial, because everybody needs to be like quite coordinated in their efforts to do this. So I think that's where there's an advantage with being a smaller team.
And that was actually going to be, the next thing I wanted to ask about is, how has this affected your thoughts as CEO in terms of team formation and hiring, both the frequency and timing of hiring, but also the types of skills that you look for when you do hire into your startup?
I think one thing that is pretty obvious is you have to be using AI a lot. The cost of code is essentially approaching zero. So I think really great engineers who take pride in code quality have a lot of sort of readjusting to do. I still think these are the right types of people to hire, but I think they also have a bit of a hard time with that transition. But if they do make that transition, they're incredible people to have, because their role can be elevated to those of more of an architect and a designer, like you said, but they will still have a first principles understanding of what is good quality and where taste matters in terms of quality. That's really important. But yeah, the expectation is to be using AI as much as possible.
A quick break to talk about domains. Here's the thing, if you get your startup domain right, you never think about it again, but get it wrong and it's a stone in your shoe for years. My previous startup was called Circular, but circular.com, of course, not available. So we registered nowcircular.com. And honestly, it was a bit of a nightmare. People couldn't find us. They weren't sure what we were called. They went to the wrong site. We kept debating internally whether to rebrand. We never did, and the distraction, well, it never stopped. I wish we'd known about .tech, the top-level domain created specifically for technology companies. When the .coms were taken, we just added now to make something work. But if I'd looked at .tech back then, I could have secured a strong, memorable domain. One that clearly told the world we were building a technology company. No weird prefixes, no creative misspellings, just circular.tech. So learn from my mistake. Go to your favorite registrar, grab a banger.tech domain that really tells the world who you are, and then forget about it. After all, you've got a company to build. I was just at a sort of a small senior engineering dinner last night, and we were talking about all of this stuff. And in a sense, that grieving process that especially senior software engineers, principal people who have that love of craft are going through. But as you say, the interesting thing here is it comes down to how you define your identity. And identity is this very powerful tool for humans, right? Which is the way you define your identity kind of then speaks to how you view the world. And if you identify as a craftsperson of code, whether you like it or not, that is no longer really the value that you bring to an organization. If you want to do it as a hobby in your free time, you love writing code, be my guest. And of course, there are still pockets where that's important, but most of the time, an engineer needs to define themselves as something different, as you say. And I think that is spreading to more and more roles where you need to change your identity of how you view your skill set and your role set so that you are able to adapt and still keep that pride and that sense of identity in what you do. So yeah, once again, we're really placing this premium on adaptability.
Definitely. And I think the good news is that I do feel like this is the type of person that is extremely valuable on the other end of that grieving process, which is such a sad way of thinking about it. But it is true because they do have a fundamental understanding of, good software and good software design and good code. So I feel like that's important. It's just, I think it's, it is true that more people can operate like an engineer. An example is our head of design, Beck, has access to GitHub and raises pull requests. And we can actually get rid of Figma because the entire design system can be managed in code.
Yes.
And if that needs to be rendered or visualized, that can be done on the fly in artifacts using Claude. So it does mean that more people can be contributing to your code base, but you still want people around who are seasoned and have that experience and can know when things might be drifting.
Right. And of course, this is the exact same sort of identity threat that designers face. So you now have your head of design who is effectively, you said, moving away from Figma. So the tool that for the last 5+ years has nearly defined what it means to be a designer is quickly becoming obsolete in its current form, let's say. I think Figma is an amazing company, and I know they're thinking very hard about how they serve this next level. But the idea that you're moving around screens in Figma when you can be actually writing code in GitHub, but at the same time when the tools can actually do a lot of really good or at least decent amounts of that grunt work for you, especially if you have a design system, to your point, that means that the role of designer has really changed as well. And designers that want to cling on to pushing pixels around are going to have the same challenge as engineers who cling on to that identity of being the person who writes the code. We're moving into these different levels of abstraction, and the boundaries and the roles are shifting, and it's a fascinating time to be building a startup. But it also feels like the best time, doesn't it? Because startups are about disruption and challenging the status quo. And so I think we are in that best position to take advantage of all of this if we have the courage, and if our teams have the courage and the support to be as adaptable as the technology really requires them to be.
It's actually kind of funny. Our head of design is the only person who consistently hits usage limits, even on a max plan with Claude. Not even our engineers do that. So she's cooking something up. I think maybe it takes more tokens to generate prototypes. I don't know. Past couple of weeks, we've really started to question any SaaS product we use. Because I think the build versus buy equation totally shifts, because if the cost of code is approaching zero, it means building is always cheaper, essentially. And so genuinely, we're really looking at each of the different software applications we use and thinking, do we actually need that? Because a lot of it just gets converged into Claude plus GitHub.
Yeah,
Claude
well, exactly. It's
repo.
Funny. I'm thinking of getting rid of our CMS because I'm like, at our volume especially, if I want to create a new static piece of content, it's easier just to paste the text into Claude and say, create a new static page, than put it into a CMS and then have a framework for retrieving that and rendering it. I'm just like, we just got out a new privacy policy. And I'm like, I'm just going to paste the document into Claude Code and say, put this up.
Yeah,
exactly. And format it appropriately. Like, why would I go through a CMS for that? And so, and the same thing applies across the board to more and more things where you're like, the reason CMS existed was because hand coding a static page for every new piece of content was laborious. And it was something that only engineers could do. So if you had a marketing team or whatever who wanted to churn out content, you needed this thing. But now, I don't know. Like, of course, this is like a sort of classic disruption from the bottom up. If you're running a massive content organization, then of course you still need a CMS. But if you're a startup and you are putting up, a few articles a month, you probably don't need it anymore, right? And then it's slowly going to move up the chain.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so things like, okay, release notes get updated into Notion. Why would you do that? I can ask Claude for the release notes from the repo. So it's it completely changes the whole kind of stack.
And it changes it, but to your point, I think it potentially collapses the stack as well. I actually had an episode a couple of weeks ago where we talked about to-do lists moving into to-done lists. Like, why would you file an issue into Jira and then groom the backlog and then come back to it in a few weeks and prioritize, where you could just put that same issue into Claude Code and get a PR out of it, right?
Yeah, it's so true. This is a pretty radical thing, and we've just started to do this today. And I might get in trouble for talking about it because we probably seem like crazy people.
We love getting you in trouble.
This is probably going to seem like crazy sort of tech founder stuff, but everyone in the team is really happy to do it. So we've decided that we will actually wear mics. That's why I had the little DJI mic, because we've just bought a few of these, and we will wear mics and we will transcribe every conversation we have, because we know that we will verbally solution design in meetings as a product team to the extent that that context is complete enough and useful enough for Claude to actually implement it. So this is the context curation thing. If we're talking about a solution and we all agree that's the solution and we know Claude can do it, why create any lead time between the conversation and that happening? It should just be...
I love it. Sorry, you've got me all tingly, because I'm like, okay, so what you're actually saying is now, instead of going from like writing up a to-do to a PR, you go straight from having a meeting and you come out of the meeting and Claude's already written a bunch of code based on what you agreed in the meeting for you to review.
100, exactly. And maybe even do away with meetings. I mean, maybe you have meetings specifically for the intended purpose of talking about as a group what you want to talk about for Claude to be able to do it. But aside from that, just capture like the conversations that happen incidentally, where all of these nuggets of gold add up to, that actually a viable feature, or an improvement to the product. Yeah, it's a bit crazy, but we're trying it out. We'll see how it goes.
It makes perfect sense to me. And again, in the spirit of what we were talking about, which is kind of skating to where the puck is headed. Like, it's maybe a little bit crazy now. It's only borderline crazy. It'll be hardly crazy at all in 6 months, because like you say, the cost of code becomes low. You're only paying for tokens, and tokens are a lot cheaper than people. Even with people complaining about, I have to pay $400 a month or $1,000 a month, it's like, it's still cheap. And if what you have is just all of these prototypes or like mostly completed features sitting there waiting for you to review, tweak, and ship, that's pretty incredible, right? You're sort of wandering through this like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of, instead of like, you're really collapsing that stack down, right? From, okay, we need to have the meeting, then we need to take the meeting notes, then we need to file a ticket in Jira, then we have to have a backlog grooming, then we have to do some spikes, then we have to schedule into a sprint, then we have to build the thing, then we need to review it. You skip all of those intermediate steps, you've got the thing. It won't be perfect, but it's so quick. And then iterating on that is so quick as well. Going back to that gardening analogy you brought up and that question of pruning and so on, it's nearly like you've got this ultra powerful fertilizer and you've just got plants growing everywhere.
Yes.
And the real art now is keeping the garden under control.
Absolutely.
Rather than actually eking things out of the soil.
Exactly.
Sorry, I'm an analogies guy.
No, it's actually really funny how much mileage this analogy has. It actually does feel a little bit crazy, but we've just started to lean into it. Like today, actually, this is a really specific example, but we have wanted to, there's been an issue in Linear to update some icons in our app, which is it's just so not important. But we were talking about it. I was talking about it with an engineer and she had the mic on and she just started to say, okay, so Claude, for reference, would just like to update those icons. And just so because she knew that would be saved in the transcript and Claude later could pick it up and do it. And I just thought, oh my gosh, we're going crazy.
It's good crazy. I think this is the concrete stuff that everyone's figuring this out in real time. And so one of the things that we want to do with this podcast is to sort of share the things that,
Yeah,
it might be borderline crazy now, but won't be for very long. So people can learn the new best practices as they emerge. And I think this will be one of them.
Okay, so this one is this is a little crazy, but completely doable. It's not being done now, but it will be happening soon. Whenever there is any product update, at the moment, it's a conversation in the team to come up with how we're going to tell users and customers about it. How do you share with the existing users that are, using the app all the time versus maybe the prospect in our pipeline who we've been in touch with for ages, who is not quite ready at the moment, but they want updates here and there. Totally different contexts, like those stakeholders, and totally different person in the team who would do that. How you tailor that to each of them would be completely different. And so now we're thinking, well, why shouldn't there just be a profile of all of the people that we've talked to among all of our customers that Claude has access to and then can use as context to understand how to provide a contextualized update to that person personally whenever there's an update in our repo. So if there's a new feature that comes out, you could say to an occupational therapist supporting disability clients in Perth, hey, I've seen that you were recently helping this person with an assessment. You had a bit of trouble with understanding their mobility. Did you know that we've added this way for you to summarize person's mobility using this new format or something? I'm just making something up.
Yeah, no, I totally understand.
Versus...
And again, doesn't seem that crazy. In fact, one of the things, again, on that previous episode that we released, this is the one with Gary Lowe, folks. You should listen to that one too. I think it's a great complement to this. We were talking about the fact that with things like MCP and so on, nearly this idea of agents, of AIs talking to AIs, it's not a new idea at all, right? The idea of having a whole bunch of services sitting behind APIs and them orchestrating each other agentically, it dates back to the early 2000s, if not before that, right? And it had names that sound very dated now, like service-oriented architecture and Internet of Things and that sort of thing. And even SaaS, I think, originally meant more like, hey, let's just have a bunch of APIs that talk to each other than cloud-hosted web apps. But the problem was the technology was not quite there to do the orchestration. And AI comes in and it's like, I can do the orchestration. And so now you've got more and more software using other software like that. And you get that idea of a service-oriented internet really becoming real now. And so I think what you're talking about here, what it makes me think is the idea of personalization is old, right? If you look at most modern tools for email communication and whatnot, you've got all of this customer segmentation. You set up segments and you say, we send this sort of message to that segment and that sort of message to the other segment. But once again, it's like now the technology might be at the point where it's like, instead of having these static segments and then building semi-personalized content for each segment, we go straight to let's genuinely personalize each piece of content for its sole recipient. Is that now possible? And it sounds like you're saying, yeah, well, that's something that you're trying to do. And again, if it's not possible now, it feels like it will be by the end of this year.
Definitely. I think all of the building blocks are there to be able to orchestrate it. You just need the context. Good context accessibility for Claude, I suppose, one way of putting it. I have seen that we have sort of shifted in, there's been multiple times where we've had a significant shift in terms of our understanding of our own product. And I think what's really interesting is that this has sort of coincided with don't know how technical I should get, but the underlying data model and kind of communication protocol that is most relevant to the software's architecture. So we've realized, at the moment, it's built on sort of records. So, flexible data model called a record. We've actually realized for our users and our customers to get the most out of this system, we actually need an event-driven architecture, because you just need to essentially hook up an agentic harness to that event stream. And then the breadth of things that they can do with it is just way bigger. But that's really only the case with, probably maybe the models now and the next suite of models coming through. So I think having a good sense on, how you do need to re-architect is really important. And it's only really in hindsight that we've done that a couple of times now. We realize, that's something that you need to kind of deliberately plan for.
It's really interesting. Again, just the fluidity of everything. You can change faster than you ever did before. You can move your data model from one to another. You can do that migration a lot more cheaply, but also the necessity to do those sorts of migrations frequently goes up. And so I think that's everything's just kind of accelerated, but also made less costly at the same time. So it just creates this incredibly dynamic context, which I think with the right attitude, you use the word exhilarating, I think is completely true. Yeah, it can be easy to be overwhelmed by it, but I guess it's just you've got to ride it like a wave. It's the only way to handle this thing.
Totally.
And you wake up every morning and think, what's changed since yesterday, and how do I respond? But yeah, we're living in a bit of an age of miracles, so it's a pretty cool time.
Great time to be alive.
Great time to be alive. So Keoki, this has been a fantastic conversation. If people want to learn more about you, about your thinking, to follow you online, or more about your startup, Minikai, what's the best way for them to keep up to date?
Probably just our website, minikai.com. I don't know if providers listen to this, but yeah, obviously you can book in a demo.
Everyone listens to this podcast, mate. Fantastic. All right, well, thanks so much for being generous with your time. I know that Minikai is going gangbusters, which means there are a lot of demands on your time. I'll let you get back to it, but really enjoyed the conversation. I know folks will get a huge amount out of it.
Oh, likewise. Thanks, Yaniv, and thank you for hosting me. It's been a great conversation.
All right, have a good one.
Likewise, you too.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Warp Development. I know a lot of you rely on dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of these agencies suck. Ask me how I know. I've been looking for one that I can really endorse, and I have finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have over 100 experts who don't just code, they solve business problems alongside you. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp Development delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation.